Welcome, I'm Bill Brewster and this is Drywall Techniques. Today's series is Series 11, Interior Painting 101. Before we break out the primer, we have to mask and prep the walls. We've done a significant amount of sanding, so at this point we have a damp rag and we're going to walk around and wipe down the baseboards, door jambs, and counters, wherever we're going to be taping up to the walls or ceilings. It's very important to have a dry and dust-free surface to mask our woodwork off with. So at this point we have ourselves a masking machine, which makes life a lot easier. When using a masking machine, make sure when you tape your baseboards or your trim, you don't run the tape up onto the wall at all, because all that will do is when you pull your paper and tape off, it could have a tendency not only to have a gap of no color, but it could end up tearing your paint back and have bare sheetrock paper. So at this point you want to make sure it's a good bonding, and then you're ready for the next piece. This is a very time-consuming process, but it's a very important process. Because at this point, this process could make or break a successful job. It's also good to remember you don't want to use white masking tape when you decide to mask off. It has too much glue in it, and all it's going to do is cause problems. If you leave it out for a long period of time, it'll end up pulling your wood off, it'll pull your paint off, and it can pull your lacquer off. So what a lot of painters do is they use the blue or green painter's tape. It doesn't have as much glue in it, and it won't do damage like the white tape will. When you come to a corner like this, instead of having the paper flap around, fold it underneath and make a crease. It's not as crucial with painting with a brush to have this taped down as tight, but when you're doing any spraying whatsoever, the air can definitely catch it and blow it up into your product. So it's always good to make sure it's taped down securely. It's nice using the masking machine or masking off door jambs. You can pull long sections of paper off, and then you can tape off your trim. But remember, keep the tape off the wall. And at this point, you can take some tape and mask off the rest of the doorway or door jamb by wrapping it around. You can mask off the rest of the doorway by just wrapping the paper around, which will protect the entire face of the door jamb without wasting a lot of valuable time. And when masking off outlets or light switches, all you have to do is just run a piece of tape over the top. Make sure your tape doesn't overlap over onto the wall. It's not necessary to overlap the paper as much as I do. It's just a force of habit when doing a lot of spraying. A little extra precaution. And always tape to the floor as well. When your masking machine runs out of tape, it's easy to switch out of tape, pull out the excess, tear that off, find the proper end of the tape, right there, press it on, just take this end of the tape and just stick it right on the paper itself. You pull the paper from this end, automatically feeds it. And you're back in business. As you can see, we just finished laying down our tarp. It's very important to make sure that you have complete floor protection. That way you don't risk spilling any paint or primer on your wood floors. As you'll see, we're priming over two different surfaces today. On this surface is a putty coat. It's a full coat of mud over the wall, so it'll absorb the primer and paint differently than over sheetrock. The other surface we'll be priming today is a sheetrock surface. You can see the mud where the screw tracks are, as well as the flats and the butt joints that have mud on them. But as we sand, it has a tendency to rough up the paper of the sheetrock. Now, if this isn't laid down properly, this fuzzed up paper can show up under your primer as a very, very nappy looking primer. So what we're going to do to try to clean this up so our primer looks really good is to dampen a sponge and go around the perimeter and lay down that fuzzed up paper before we prime. This takes a little bit of time. It blends in the mud into the paper. And it gives you a much nicer finished product. It's a good idea to thoroughly stir your primer or paint prior to using. It's also a good idea, if the color of your finish paint is darker than your primer, to tint your primer. That way it covers much easier. The primer sealer coat's a very important coat. That's why apply it right onto the wall at its full strength. Don't try to make it go farther by diluting it down with water. Now we're ready to start priming. What we're going to do is we're going to start off in the angles and start cutting in. Keep applying long, even strokes. Make sure you're not loading an angle up too terribly much so you have runs. Make sure there are no heavy edges along the sides whatsoever. It's also a good idea to use your paintbrush to paint around outlets and light switches. Also make sure you cut in around cabinets and baseboards. During this process, there's no real reason to get yourself into a big hurry. Just take your time and methodically go through and hit every spot. Well, we're finished cutting with the paintbrush. Now we're going to use the roller. Being that our finished product is smooth wall, we'll be using a 1/4 inch nap roller. Well, we're going to roll out our lids first. That way if we drop any paint or primer, we're not going to mess up our walls. Make sure you overlap into your corners a little bit. Then go back over. Make sure you don't have a lot of heavy edges. And also make sure you don't have dry spots or dry rolling, as in this area right here. Went back rolling. Apply more pressure on this side of the roller as you come this way. Lightly go back over. And take down any edges. Remember, apply more pressure, such as this, on this corner as you work this way. That allows this corner not to leave a pronounced edge of paint. Remember, when you start rolling your primer on, initially all you're doing is loading up the wall with paint, trying to get it even as possible, not too terribly heavy, but a good coverage. As you see these edges on either side of the roller, apply a little bit more pressure on that side to clean that off, as well as this other side. Don't press too terribly hard because that could cause an indentation in the sheetrock, or in this case, the drywall compound. But once you get your coat on, then you can work it. Up and down strokes. Keep going in the same direction. Go up to the angle as far as you can without touching the other side or running into the angle. Then as you're rolling, apply more pressure on this side. Work your way this way. Alleviates pressure off of this side of the roller and will cut down on any kind of buildup or drag of extra paint or primer being left. As you can see, this wall is not very flat. It is dished in this way, so when I roll, more pressure is automatically on either side of this, the rollers. So you may have to roll sideways to get it filled. Nice long strokes. Gives you a very, very small nap or a texture from the roller itself. There we go. And where a standard 9-inch roller won't fit, you can always use one of these small rollers to finish off your job. I've never really been a big fan of these kind of rollers, but they definitely have their place. And you need that consistent texture of the roller nap. Now that the PVA is dry, you can see the imperfections left to be taken care of. A lot of times these little imperfections were buried by drywall dust being kind of packed into these things, and once you roll the primer over the top, it has a tendency to pull out the dust out of the air bubbles or scratches or little incidental marks. So at this point, it's a good time to do your touch-up. Another good reason why it's important to be able to do your touch-up over the top of primer is on a putty-coated surface, which this wall was. The drywall base coat that we ended up sanding was a lot softer than our touch-up mud because it's pretty much put on and taken right off. When this would be sanded over the top of just raw drywall mud, there's a good chance that this touch-up area would sand off harder than the mud that was around it. So once you go to sand it, basically you'll have a layered look that this would be staying fast and the mud around it could be sanded off faster. So at this point it's best to be able to prime the wall first, and then come back and take care of your touch-up. That way you will never sand down past your primer. So there's no way of sanding down past your primer in this. And once your touch-up is dry, you can sand it out with a sanding sponge. Then take your small detailed paint roller and prime this area, spot roll it, and then when that dries, you'll be ready to start putting your finished paint on. We'll be using a fine, extra fine sanding sponge that we've been using through the project. Make sure you get the edges of the cap and the touch-up area very good. It's also a good idea to use your sanding light. That way you see that you're not over sanding anything or leaving any extra marks as you're sanding out. You can also run your hand across it to see if there's a lump. A lot of body men who do auto body, they use this technique as well. They use sight as well as touch to determine if there's a lump in a wall. Now that the touch was sanded out, use a water sponge and lightly wipe in the perimeter around the touch-up. This way it'll blend in the mud into the existing texture, the nap of the roller with the primer. That way it blends in nicely. If not, it could have a tendency to leave an edge that may show up through your semi-gloss paint or eggshell paint. And now we're ready to start prepping the rest of the primer walls. What we're going to be doing now is lightly dusting down the primer. So we'll be using the 220 screen on the sanding pole. The 220 screen's been wore out pretty well. We used it for our finish sanding, and this way it'll just cut off any boogers or any kind of little debris that's on our primered walls before we put on our finish paint. Make sure when you're using your sanding pole, keep it from flipping over on you. Make sure you don't bump or dent the angles. Lightly sand it, top to bottom. Well, we're ready to put our finish coat on. We'll be using white semi-gloss paint. We're going to use the same process or method as putting on the primer. We'll start by cutting in first and then rolling the field. Make sure to leave no heavy edges. Also make sure you paint around all outlets, all plugs. Any small bit of detail. Make sure you use one long even stroke on your final pass on a particular section that you're working on. That way you have no heavy starts or stops to contend with. When rolling your finish paint on, always roll in the same direction. Long even strokes. And as you're taking, when you're back rolling, make sure you apply more pressure on one side than the other and work your way this way as you go, because this wheel right here will have a tendency to cut in and leave a mark or an edge of paint. Long even strokes. Make sure you look at the texture of the nap of the paint to make sure it's even and not heavier in one spot and lighter in another. And also make sure you're not dry rolling your paint. Remember to always finish paint your ceilings first. That way if you're going to draw paint, you're not going to be dropping it on your finished walls. Now we're ready to start rolling out the walls. Semi-gloss paint is definitely not as forgiving as flat paint. It has a way of showing up a lot of imperfections, not only in the paint, but also the sheetrock itself. So prepping is extremely important before you even start finished painting. Now at this point we're back rolling. As you can see, our touch-up has all blended in. Always make sure when you touch up over your primer, you sand it out, sponge it with water, and then you spot prime it. That way it doesn't have a tendency to flash through your finished paint. it's definitely best not to get into a rush when you're at this stage of the game, because this will be truly the finished product you'll be looking at for some time to come. So make sure you have things as even as possible. Make sure the nap or the texture of the primer or the paint is consistent all the way across, not thin here and splotchy here. Take the extra time to back roll it to make sure everything's just right. Make sure there's no roller marks anywhere, and also pull in the same direction and not sideways. All keep things as consistent as possible. Well, we're at the end of our project. Thank you for watching Drywall Techniques.